The whole sad mess started in May of 2011. I'd been living in a 2-bedroom house next to campus for 2 years. No girlfriend to speak of and lonely as hell. So, when Rachel moved in next door, I was praying for a shot. I was so lonely, in fact, her 10-year-old son didn't scare me off. Being a tall, buxom redhead made her my dream girl. I say girl, but she was 30, a woman, and almost 8 years older than me. Hellos and how are yous were shared each morning, and I did my utmost to keep her from noticing how creepy and awkward I really was. The way in which I fumbled over my words, as embarrassing as it was, didn't drive her away. As the months compounded, our talks became more personal and I, less nervous. Before I knew it, she had asked me to take her out and I agreed. I was still a poor student, but even with that, our dinner went well, and we progressively drew closer and closer. Her son actually turned out to be a cool kid, and he and I would often play video games together. I did my best to not appear as if I was trying to be a father to him. More of a friend, really. The situation did cause me to wonder why his father wasn't in his life. The possibility of him being dead did enter my mind, and I thought if I asked, it might bring up unresolved issues. The truth would turn out to be far worse. The good times went to shit when her ex-husband arrived unannounced at her house. I wasn't there when he showed up, but the fight between the two clued me in. At the time, I was just waking up and heard yelling coming from across the street. I peeked through the blinds in time to witness him hitting her across the head and body. This instance would be the first of many and was the moment I knew what we had was over. Long ago, I learned the hard way not to get involved in an argument between partners. If you're lucky, you get out unscathed, but if you try to be a hero, the effort rarely gets rewarded. Even if she would have asked for help, I probably wouldn't have done it, but she never did. In fact, for the remaining time she and her son lived there, no words passed between the two of us. The ex would move in not long after and stayed until they moved out. A few times, she and I would share a passing look, her eyes projecting an air of regret and apology, but nothing became of it. I made the choice to move on, just as she had. Many times more, I would witness the abuse, and at least once, she knew I had. No one was going to save her but herself. I did have one more brief conversation with her son. He let me know his father had returned home from jail, and the whole family was about to move across town to a trailer park. This talk was probably more of a way to let me know what happened than a friendly goodbye. I thanked him and said a goodbye myself. They moved the next week, and that was the last time I saw either of them. Despite the overwhelming feelings of loss I carry with me, the truth is she was always too good for me. An unconfident and shy boy was never a match for a beautiful young woman. At least that's what I tell myself. No matter how brief our time together was, it was the best of my life, and I pray nightly I'll feel that joy again. Has your neighbor ever tried to kill you? Mine did. Wanna guess why? Because my dog shit in his yard once. This dude had been nothing but trouble since I moved in. He would strut around without a shirt on in summer and occasionally flex and then look around to see if anyone was watching. You would think a guy trying to appear as macho as possible would be a man's man, but this was not the case. Anything that required any real physical labor, except for lifting weights, was done by his wife, a woman who was maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. I may have given him a pass on the lawn mowing. Maybe he had bad allergies, but that wasn't it. They owned this ridiculous jacked-up truck with an annoyingly loud exhaust, and you know who did all the maintenance on it, the wife. She had to use a stepladder just to get in the thing. When I realized he was just something to look at and had no bite behind his bark, any fear I may have had of him faded away. Enough of the small talk, though. The point of this whole story is what happened one quiet Sunday morning as I stepped out to get the paper. 9 times out of 10, my wife's little furry rat of a dog, he's actually pretty cool, follows me out the door when I go to retrieve it. This morning was one of the 9, and while I searched the fading darkness for my paper, he pranced off to the grassy area alongside the driveway to relieve himself. I thought nothing of it at the time. It's something that happens occasionally, and when I notice he does it, I'll return from the house with a bag to pick it up. Not even I like dog crap in my yard, but I generally don't go super scion when I see it. They got to go somewhere after all. Anyhow, after I found it, I returned to the house with my paper. I'd noticed out of the corner of my eye the yappy bugger was in a familiar stance, and I'd have to come back and pick it up. So, I grab a bag and head for the door. This had to have been 30 seconds from dump to door, maybe. I reach the door, and before I can grab the knob, my neighbor comes banging on it. Not a kind knock either. This is 7:30 in the morning, everyone else in the house is still in bed. So, his loud knocking and yelling pissed me off before a word was even said between us. I open the door, and he starts ranting about how my dog just crapped in his yard. I automatically tell him to lower his voice, but he kept on with the yelling. I tried to explain to him what I was doing, I even showed him the bag, but he continued. I pushed past the idiot and go to pick it up. When I find the pile, I see that it's actually well within the bounds of my property, so I get even angrier than I already was. I dispose of the crap in a nearby trash can and turn to go back in. This whole time I'd been swallowing my feelings, but then he made a big mistake. He threatened to kill the dog if it ever came into his yard again. This was something I couldn't let pass. I may make jokes about the little thing, but my wife loves him like he's her own child, and I love my wife. So, even if it was only a threat, I knew my wife would be upset if she heard it. I got in his face and started yelling threats back at him. When he began poking me in the chest with his finger, I reflexively pushed him away and he fell on his ass. He stared at me speechless with a look of shock on his well-moisturized face. Now that he'd shut up, I assumed he had got the point and I finally could go back in my house. I foolishly thought that was the end of it, at least for the time being. However, less than 2 minutes later, he starts pounding on our door again. By now, my wife had awoken and was in the kitchen asking me what was going on. I forgot to mention, this whole time, that furry bugger was barking his head off. My wife picks him up to calm him down, and I storm to the door, ready to strangle the a-hole. When I yank the thing open, the psycho is standing there with a gun and takes a shot at me. Just by a hair, the bullet zips past my head and comes real damn close to hitting my wife. How he missed at that near distance, I don't know, but I'm sure happy he did. I slammed the door closed and expected more shots to come roaring through it, but none came. I ran for my phone and saw my wife had already called the cops. They tell her that there's been a few calls from the area and cars had already been dispatched. They show up and we tell our side of the story and show them the bullet in the wall. The guy couldn't deny he'd fired a gun. The proof was right there, and a few of the other neighbors had made complaints about someone shooting, so they put the cuffs on him, and we watched as they took him away. Later in the day, his wife came over and apologized to us for all the problems. I'd never had a problem with her in the first place and told her so. She thanked me and let me know they were going to be moving. The truth of the matter was, they couldn't afford the house anymore, and with the crap he'd just pulled, they were going to need all the money they could get to hire a lawyer. She didn't say much else after that. Just apologized once more and left. Less than a week later, they were gone. It wasn't long before another family moved in, and they've been great neighbors. Although the entire comedy of errors was what it took to get rid of him, I'm still not sure my wife and I almost getting killed was worth it. I had a female neighbor as a kid. Her family were a little odd. They do very unsafe things like chuck throwing stars at each other. Normally the stars never struck one of them, except for this one time when the girl threw one at her younger brother and it stuck in the back of his forearm. It wasn't really deep, mind you, but it still was in deep enough to not fall out when he moved the arm. Instead of freaking out like any sane 10-year-old would do, he laughed and pulled the thing out. Rather than calling it quits for the day, he threw it back at her. For a while, I thought it was because they were half Japanese and that's just what they did, but as I grew up, I realized they were just crazy people. When I was 16, the girl and I started messing around. I'm not sure how it happened. One day I was hanging out at their house and I realized I was attracted to her. Not long after, we happened to be wrestling around with each other and she pinned me down and began kissing me. It was all uphill from there. Some days we'd only touch one another's bodies and some days it was full-blown sex. We had been doing our best to hide what we were doing, but one day, her older brother found out and decided to torture me for it. I never could get a straight answer from her how he found out, but he had, and that was all that mattered. When he first approached me, I lied, but he saw right through me. Next, I began apologizing, but he still said nothing. His silence was terrifying, but not as much as the knife he was holding in his hand. At that moment, I was standing roughly 10 feet away from him. I eventually ran out of things to say, and we just stared at each other. The long seconds started to get to me, and I yelled at him to say something. Instead, he smiled, raised his hand, and threw the knife at me. I instinctively cowered and covered my head, but it sailed above me and hit the wall. There was no way I was going to stick around and become a pincushion, so I fled across the living room. He kept up his silent treatment. It was clearly working. I stopped to turn and look to see where he was. I saw him bend over and pick up the knife. When he'd seen I'd stopped, he threw it again. I saw what he was about to do and ran out the front door of the house. I didn't stop this time until I was inside my own house. As I ran into our living room, my mom stopped me and asked why I was running. It wasn't the first time I'd come running into the house, but I must have been horrified looking. I very nearly blurted it out, but remembered what had initiated the chase in the first place. Telling my mom anything about who I'd been having sex with, or even admitting I had those type of thoughts, scared me much more than having sharp things thrown at me, so I told her I was very thirsty and was running into the kitchen to get a Coke. I'm not sure she believed me, but she let it go when I slipped off to the kitchen. Later in the day, my playmate called me to come over, but I swore I'd never go over there again, as long as her brother was around. She didn't know what had happened until I explained it to her. I hoped she'd get mad about how I was treated. Instead, she changed the subject and said she'd come over to my house. It was a little harder to mess around at my place. My folks were always around, at least one of them. I was kind of pissed off she didn't stick up for me, and obviously still shaken from nearly dying, but she was able to take my mind off all that rather easily. We took the opportunity to make up when my mom stepped out for a few things, and we continued messing around any chance we had. I did stick by my pledge, however. I didn't step one foot in her house for the remainder of my time living with my folks. College came around in a few years, and other than small visits at holidays, her and I never saw each other after I left. I did run into her older brother during one Thanksgiving. Even though we were both adults now, and many years had passed since our talk, the memory of it was still strong and I expected him to chuck a knife at me any second.